I've spent my entire life learning to recognize patterns that don't belong, and what that waitress did in under 10 seconds was something no one should have been able to do. The footage paused on the exact frame where her lips moved, the restaurant's overhead lights casting a soft amber glow across her face, and yet nothing about it felt ordinary, not the way she knelt beside the boy, not the way the chaos in that room seemed to fold in on itself as if someone had turned down the volume on reality, and certainly not the language she chose, Korean, spoken with a precision that wasn't learned from textbooks or late-night apps but from something deeper, something lived. I leaned back in my chair, the leather creaking softly beneath me, and watched it again, slower this time, tracking the rhythm of her breathing, the pause before each word, the subtle tilt of her head that mirrored the child's movements like she was guiding him out of a storm only she could see, and that's when it hit me, not as a thought but as a certainty, cold and immediate. This wasn't coincidence. People don't just stumble into moments like that, not in my world. The boy had been screaming before she approached, hands over his ears, body locked in panic while a dozen adults stood frozen, unsure, uncomfortable, waiting for someone else to act, and then she stepped in, quiet, controlled, like she had done it 1,000 times before, like she knew exactly where the breaking point was and how to pull him back from it without force, without fear, just a few words and a presence that didn't belong behind a name tag and a black apron. I tapped the screen, zooming in until the pixels started to blur, focusing on her eyes, steady, unshaken, not searching for approval, not looking around to see who was watching, just locked onto the boy as if nothing else in that room existed, and that's what made it worse. People like that don't perform. They don't need an audience, which means whatever she is. Whatever she was trained to be, it wasn't for show. The restaurant noise came back in layers as the clip resumed, silverware clinking, low conversations picking up again, a manager stepping forward too late to matter, and she stood, brushing her hands together once, as if the moment had cost her nothing, as if calming a child on the edge of collapse was just another part of her shift, just another table served, another task checked off. I let the video run to the end, watching her disappear into the background, blending in with the rest of the staff so completely it would have been easy to miss her entirely if you weren't looking for the right things, but I was always looking. That's the difference. That's why I'm still here. My fingers rested on the edge of the desk, still, deliberate, as I replayed the first 5 seconds again, the exact moment her voice cut through the noise and everything changed, and I felt it then, that familiar shift, the one that comes right before something important surfaces, the one that tells you the world just revealed a piece of itself it wasn't supposed to show you. I didn't ask questions. I didn't call it interesting or strange. I don't deal in those kinds of words. I deal in certainty, and this was one of those moments, the kind that redraws lines you didn't even realize were there. I reached for my phone, already knowing what I was going to say before the line even connected, because there was only one response to something like this, only one way forward when the pattern breaks this cleanly, and when my voice finally cut through the silence, it was calm, measured, exactly as it always is. Find everything about her. The call was answered before the second ring, which was exactly why I kept him on my payroll, not because he was fast, but because he understood when speed mattered. I did not repeat myself, I did not explain context, I simply gave a name, a location, and a timestamp. And on the other end there was a pause, not confusion, but recognition, the kind that comes when someone realizes this is not routine, that whatever follows is going to require more than a surface search, and that is when I ended the call, because the rest does not need to be said out loud. I turned back to the screen, letting the footage loop again without sound this time, stripping away the noise until all that remained was movement, timing, control. The elements that never lie, and the more I watched, the more precise it became, the way she lowered herself to the child's level without hesitation, not too fast, not too slow, matching his space instead of invading it, her hands open, relaxed, never reaching until the exact second he stopped pulling away, and that detail mattered more than the language itself, because words can be learned, but timing like that is trained, conditioned, refined over years. Sometimes under pressure most people would not survive. I have seen specialists fail where she succeeded in under 10 seconds, trained professionals with certifications, teams, protocols, and yet she did it alone, without tools, without preparation, as if she had been waiting for that exact moment. I stood and walked toward the window, the city stretching out below in clean lines and controlled movement, Traffic flowing in patterns that could be predicted if you knew where to look, and that is what this felt like, a disruption in a system that otherwise made sense, a variable that should not exist but clearly did. By the time I returned to the desk, the first report had already started to come in, partial, incomplete, but enough to confirm what I expected. Her name, Naomi Carter, employment records that matched a dozen other waitresses across the city, nothing remarkable, no flags, no incidents, no reason for anyone to look twice, which in itself was the first problem, because people like that are never this clean. Never this easy to summarize. I scrolled through the file, noting the gaps rather than the details, the periods where nothing was recorded, months turning into years with no traceable activity, no addresses, no employment, no digital footprint, and in today's world that is not normal, that is curated, that is someone making sure there is nothing to find. Another notification came through, deeper access, financials, travel logs, fragments of a history that did not align, a passport entry showing Seoul, South Korea, followed by silence, then a sudden reappearance stateside with no documented transition, as if she had simply stepped from one life into another without passing through the space in between. I slowed the scroll, reading each line carefully, not for what it said, but for what it avoided saying, and that is when I saw it, a reference buried in an older record, something minor enough to be overlooked, a volunteer listing tied to a pediatric facility overseas, specialized care, children with sensory processing conditions, autism spectrum cases that required a level of understanding most people never develop, and it connected back to the footage with a clarity that made the room feel smaller. I leaned back again, folding my hands as the pieces started to align, not fully, not yet, but enough to confirm this was not chance, not coincidence, not a waitress having a good instinct on a difficult night. This was training, experience, something deliberate carried into a place where it did not belong. The phone lit up once more, a message this time, short, efficient, exactly how I expected it to be. There is more, but someone has been cleaning her records, and I allowed myself a brief moment of stillness, not surprise, not frustration, just acknowledgement, because that meant two things: she was either protected, or she was worth hiding, and in my world those are often the same thing. I picked up the phone, already knowing the next step, because when information is missing, you do not stop, you dig deeper, you widen the search, you follow the absence until it leads you to the source. And as I brought the device to my ear, my voice did not change, steady, controlled, the same tone I have always used when something matters more than it should. I want everything, not what is easy to find, what was meant to be erased. By the time the second layer of data came in, it was no longer about who Naomi Carter was on paper, it was about who had decided she should not exist in any meaningful way, and that distinction is where most people lose track of the truth, because they chase identities instead of intent. I kept the lights low in the room, the only illumination coming from the screens in front of me, each one feeding fragments of her life that refused to connect in a way that made sense, and the more my team pushed, the more resistance they encountered. Not in the form of locked files or denied access, but something quieter, something more deliberate, records that had been adjusted just enough to appear intact while removing anything that could form a pattern. I watched as another file opened, this one older, time-stamped nearly 8 years back, tied to a pediatric center in Seoul that specialized in advanced behavioral therapy for children with complex neurological conditions. The kind of place that does not advertise, that does not appear in standard directories, and yet there it was, her name listed under a different role, not a volunteer, not support staff, but something more direct, more involved, though the title itself had been partially erased, leaving only enough to suggest she was not there by accident. I leaned closer, studying the remaining text, the way certain characters had been removed while others were left untouched. And it told me everything I needed to know. Someone had gone through this record carefully, not to delete it, but to control what could be understood from it, which meant whoever did this was not trying to hide her entirely, they were shaping the narrative of her past. Another notification appeared, a cross-reference, linking that same facility to a small number of international cases, children brought in from different countries, families with resources, with influence, the kind of people who do not rely on standard systems when something matters to them, and that is when the air in the room shifted, not physically, but in the way information begins to carry weight once it aligns with something you have been trying not to revisit. I reached for a different folder, one I had not opened in years, not because it was inaccessible, but because it belonged to a part of my life that did not benefit from being examined too closely, and yet the connection was there now, undeniable. Threading itself through data that should never have intersected, I did not open it immediately. Instead, I let the current reports continue to build, each line adding pressure to a conclusion that was forming whether I acknowledged it or not. The next message came through with more urgency, a rare shift in tone. From someone who understood how to remain neutral, we found something else. It was not meant to be connected, and I read the attached summary in silence, noting the dates, the locations, the overlap that should not have existed, a brief period where Naomi Carter had been present at the same facility during a time that aligned too closely with a case I knew by memory alone. I exhaled slowly, not out of stress, but out of recognition, because this was no longer about curiosity, this was about confirmation. I finally opened the old file, the one marked with a name I had not allowed anyone to mention in years, and the screen filled with images and reports that had once defined everything before being sealed away under the assumption that the past could remain where it belonged. I did not scroll, I did not search, I already knew what I was looking for, and when I found it, buried in a report that had been reviewed a dozen times without question, there was a reference, a minor note. About an external consultant present during a critical period, no name attached, just a description of methodology, of techniques used to stabilize a child under extreme distress, techniques that matched what I had seen in that restaurant with a precision that could not be explained by coincidence. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, not in hesitation, but in recalibration, because the situation had changed in a way that required a different kind of response, and when I opened them again, the decision was already made, not spoken, not debated, just understood. I picked up the phone once more, the weight of it familiar in my hand, and when the line connected, my voice remained exactly as it had been from the beginning, controlled, deliberate, carrying no trace of what had just shifted beneath the surface. Bring her in for observation, no contact yet. I want to see how she moves when she thinks no one is watching. Observation is not about watching what someone does, it is about noticing what they do not change when they believe they are alone, and that is where the truth always lives. The next evening, the restaurant appeared exactly as it had in the footage, the same soft lighting, the same measured noise of conversations layered over clinking glassware and low music, nothing out of place, nothing remarkable, which is exactly why it worked, because environments like this allow people to disappear in plain sight. I did not sit near the center, I never do. I chose a table with a clear line of sight to the service corridor, a position where movement could be tracked without drawing attention, and I waited. Not impatiently, not expectantly, just still, because time does not matter when the outcome is already in motion. She entered from the back, not rushing, not lingering, carrying a tray with the same quiet control I had seen before, her posture balanced, her steps consistent, every motion efficient without appearing mechanical, and that detail mattered, because trained individuals either become too precise or too relaxed, but she existed somewhere in between. A space that is much harder to maintain unless it has been reinforced over years. I watched as she moved between tables, interacting just enough to fulfill her role, polite but not engaging, attentive but never overly present, as if she understood exactly how much of herself to reveal and nothing more, and there was no sign that she was aware of being observed, no hesitation, no altered rhythm, which suggested either complete confidence or complete detachment, and both possibilities were equally important. A child at a nearby table dropped a fork, the sound sharp against the background noise, and for a brief moment, her eyes shifted, not toward the child, but toward the parent, assessing, calculating, then returning to her task without interruption, and it was subtle, so subtle most people would not notice it, but it confirmed what I already knew. She does not react, she evaluates, and that is not something taught in ordinary environments. Minutes passed, then more, and I allowed the pattern to unfold naturally. No interference, no signal, just observation, because the way someone behaves over time reveals more than any direct interaction ever could. Another server approached her, speaking quietly, and she responded with a nod, a few words, nothing unusual, but the cadence of her voice carried that same controlled rhythm I had heard in the footage, steady, measured, almost deliberate in its restraint, and it did not match the role she was playing. Not fully. I shifted slightly in my seat, not enough to be noticed, just enough to adjust the angle, and for the first time, her gaze moved across the room in a wider sweep, not searching, not scanning, just acknowledging the space, and for less than a second, it passed over me, and there was no reaction, no recognition, nothing to suggest she had identified anything out of place, but the timing of it stayed with me, because it was too precise to be random. The report in my pocket remained unopened, additional findings that could wait, because what mattered now was confirmation through presence, through behavior, through the kind of details that do not exist in files or records. She continued her shift as if the night held no significance, as if the moment from the previous day had never happened, and that in itself was the final piece, because people who act out of instinct often carry the residue of those moments, a slight change, a lingering awareness, but she did not. She reset completely, which means it was not instinct, it was protocol. I reached for the glass in front of me, letting the condensation settle against my fingertips, grounding the moment in something tangible, and I made the decision then, not based on the reports, not based on the data, but on what I had just seen with my own eyes, because there are points where information stops being useful and direct action becomes necessary. I stood without urgency, leaving the table as quietly as I had taken it, and as I moved toward the exit, I did not look back, not because it did not matter, but because I already had what I needed, and when I stepped outside into the cool night air, the city stretching out in controlled motion once again, I took out my phone and spoke with the same calm certainty that had guided every step so far. Prepare a direct approach, controlled environment, no variables. I want to know how she responds when the situation is no longer hers to manage. A controlled environment does not mean force, it means removing unpredictability until only truth remains, and that is what I intended to create, not a confrontation, not an interrogation, but a space where variables are reduced to zero and responses become impossible to fake. By the following afternoon, everything was already in place, a private dining room reserved under a name that would not attract attention, a location familiar enough to feel normal but isolated enough to ensure privacy, every detail calibrated to appear effortless while being anything but. I arrived early, as I always do, not out of habit but necessity, because preparation is where most outcomes are decided long before the first word is spoken. The room was quiet, soft natural light filtering through tall windows, a single table set with precision, nothing excessive, nothing distracting, just enough to suggest intention without revealing it. And I took my seat with the same measured calm that had carried me through every step of this process. The report from the previous night rested in front of me, unopened, not because it lacked value, but because I no longer needed it to confirm what I already understood. Naomi Carter was not an anomaly, she was a construct, shaped by experiences that had been deliberately hidden, and the only remaining question was whether she would acknowledge that when placed in a situation she did not control. The door opened exactly 3 minutes past the scheduled time, not late, not early, but precise in a way that felt intentional rather than coincidental, and she stepped inside without hesitation, her expression neutral, her posture unchanged from the night before, as if this was simply another shift, another room, another task to complete. She did not ask why she was there, she did not look around in confusion, she simply took in the space with a single measured glance before her eyes settled on me, steady, unflinching. And for a moment neither of us spoke, because silence, when used correctly, reveals more than questions ever could. I gestured to the chair across from me, a simple motion, controlled, leaving the decision to her, and she moved forward without pause, sitting down with the same balance I had observed in every other action, hands resting lightly on the table, not defensive, not open, just present. I studied her closely, not searching for tells, not expecting nervousness, but observing the absence of both, because people in unfamiliar situations carry tension, even if they hide it well, but she did not, which meant this was not unfamiliar to her, not entirely. I reached for the glass of water in front of me, taking a slow sip, allowing the moment to stretch just enough to shift the dynamic, and when I finally spoke, my voice carried no accusation, no urgency, just a statement placed carefully between us. You handled that situation yesterday with more precision than most trained specialists, and I watched, not for a reaction, but for the timing of one, because that is where the truth always appears. She did not respond immediately, not out of hesitation, but calculation, her eyes holding mine with a level of composure that confirmed everything I had seen so far. And when she finally spoke, her tone matched mine, controlled, measured, almost reflective, Some situations require a different kind of attention, and there it was, not a denial, not an explanation, but an acknowledgement framed in a way that revealed nothing while confirming everything. I leaned back slightly, allowing the space between us to expand just enough to reset the rhythm of the conversation, because this was not about pressing harder. It was about understanding how far she would go without being pushed. Outside, the muted sound of the city continued as if nothing had changed, as if this moment carried no weight, but inside that room, the lines had already shifted, the roles no longer as simple as observer and subject, but something far more balanced, far more deliberate, and as I set the glass back down with a quiet, controlled motion, I understood that whatever Naomi Carter had been trained to do, she was no longer operating within the boundaries of a waitress, and more importantly, she knew. That I knew, which meant the next move would not be mine alone to make. Control is not about dominating the conversation, it is about allowing the other person to reveal how much they are willing to give without being asked, and Naomi Carter understood that just as well as I did. The silence between us did not feel empty, it felt measured, like both of us were waiting to see who would define the next boundary, and that alone confirmed she was not reacting, she was participating. I shifted my gaze slightly, not away from her, but just enough to break the direct line of pressure, because tension, when sustained too long, becomes predictable, and predictability is something I avoid at all costs. You have experience, I said, my tone unchanged, not a question, not an accusation, just a placement of fact, and I watched the way her fingers adjusted slightly on the table, not tightening, not retreating, just recalibrating, a small movement that most people would miss but one that carried more information than any spoken response. She tilted her head just enough to acknowledge the statement without accepting it, her eyes steady, focused, as if weighing the value of each possible answer before choosing none of them outright. Experience is a broad term, she replied, her voice even, controlled, carrying that same layered restraint I had heard before, and it was not deflection, it was positioning, a way of keeping the conversation within her control without denying anything directly. I allowed a faint pause to settle, long enough to shift the rhythm again, then reached for the folder in front of me. Not opening it, just letting my hand rest on it, a silent indication that there was more beneath the surface, more than what had been said, and I noticed the briefest flicker in her gaze, not fear, not concern, but recognition, the kind that comes when someone realizes the scope of what is known might extend further than expected. Soul, I said quietly, placing the word between us with deliberate precision, not elaborating, not explaining, and for the first time, there was a change, subtle, controlled, but undeniable, not in her expression, but in the timing of her breath, a fraction slower, a fraction deeper, the kind of adjustment that only happens when something internal shifts. She did not look away, she did not interrupt, but the silence that followed was no longer neutral, it carried weight now, history, something that had been carefully contained until this exact moment. You have access to incomplete records, she said finally, her tone unchanged but the words themselves revealing more than intended, because they confirmed not only that the records existed, but that she knew they had been altered, curated, shaped, and that knowledge does not belong to someone on the outside. I leaned back slightly, allowing the space to widen again, because pushing further in that moment would have been inefficient. She had already crossed the line from neutral to engaged, and that is where real information begins to surface. Records are only as useful as the people behind them, I replied, letting the statement settle without pressing for agreement, and I watched as she absorbed it, not resisting, not accepting, just acknowledging its presence within the conversation. Outside the window, a car passed slowly, the muted sound barely reaching the room, but enough to mark the passage of time, grounding the moment in something real while everything else remained suspended between calculated words and unspoken truths. Naomi Carter was not denying her past, she was managing it, controlling how much of it could exist in this space, and that meant the next move would not be about uncovering facts, it would be about shifting the balance of control itself. I folded my hands together, resting them on the table, my posture unchanged, my voice steady as I placed the next piece into motion, not as a question, but as a direction. Then help me understand what is missing, and I held her gaze, not demanding, not expecting, simply allowing the weight of that request to reveal whether she would continue to protect the silence or finally decide to break it on her own terms. People reveal the truth in two ways, either by speaking it directly or by choosing not to deny it when it is placed in front of them, and Naomi Carter had already chosen the second. She did not answer immediately, not because she needed time to think, but because she was deciding how much of the truth could exist in this room without changing what came next, and that distinction mattered more than any information she could offer. Her gaze did not leave mine, steady, grounded, as if the weight of the question had already been measured and categorized before I ever spoke it, and when she finally moved, it was not to speak, but to adjust her posture slightly, a subtle shift that signaled transition, not retreat. "What is missing is not in the records," she said, her voice low, controlled, carrying that same precise cadence that had first caught my attention. And it was not an answer, it was a correction, a repositioning of the conversation itself, moving it away from documents and into something far less tangible. I let the words settle without interruption, because forcing clarification too early would only narrow the space she was willing to operate in, and right now, that space was where the real information lived. "Then where is it?" I asked, not pressing, not demanding, simply placing the next step in front of her and allowing her to decide whether to take it. She held the silence again, but this time it was different, not neutral, not measured, but layered with something else, something closer to recognition than resistance, and when she spoke again, the shift was subtle but unmistakable, in what people choose to forget, and the statement carried more weight than any detail she could have provided, because it implied intention, design, a deliberate removal of truth rather than an accidental loss of it. I leaned back slightly, absorbing the implication, because that aligned too closely with what I had already seen: records that were not erased, but curated, histories that were not lost, but edited, and the question was no longer whether Naomi Carter was part of that system, but how deeply she was embedded within it. I reached for the folder then, opening it slowly, not as a tactic, but as a continuation of the conversation, revealing just enough of its contents to confirm its relevance without exposing everything at once, and I turned it toward her, allowing her to see the single page I had selected, a report from years ago, a case that had been closed without explanation, a child whose file had been marked as resolved. Despite the absence of any clear resolution, her eyes moved across the page once, quickly, efficiently, and for the first time, there was something there, not shock, not fear, but familiarity, the kind that cannot be manufactured or hidden completely. She did not reach for the document, she did not ask how I obtained it, she simply looked at it as if it had always been part of her world. And that reaction alone confirmed what the records never could. "You were there," I said, not as a question, but as a conclusion, and the room held that statement in a silence that felt heavier than anything before it. She exhaled slowly, not in hesitation, but in acknowledgement, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried the same control as before, but now with something beneath it, something closer to inevitability. "You are looking in the wrong direction," she said, and her eyes lifted from the document back to mine, steady, unwavering. It was never about where I was, it was about who sent me there, and in that moment, the entire structure shifted, because the focus was no longer on her past, but on the force behind it, something larger, something organized, something that had not only shaped her, but had positioned her exactly where she needed to be long before I ever noticed her presence. The moment she said it, the room changed, not in sound or light, but in direction, because attention had shifted away from her and towards something neither of us had named yet, and that was where the real weight of the conversation began. I did not respond immediately, not because I lacked an answer, but because answers given too quickly close doors that should remain open, and this was not a door I intended to close. I let the silence stretch, controlled, deliberate, watching her without pressing, because people who carry information like this do not respond well to force, they respond to space, to the absence of pressure, to the opportunity to decide what comes next. "Who?" I said finally, the word simple, direct, placed without emphasis, because the tone matters more than the question itself, and I watched her carefully, not for emotion, but for calculation. Naomi did not look away, she did not shift in her seat, but something in her focus changed, as if she was no longer measuring me alone, but something beyond me, something tied to what I represented, and when she spoke, her voice remained steady, but the distance in it was new. "You already have the pieces," she said, not deflecting, not avoiding, but redirecting, and that alone confirmed that whatever she was referring to was not hidden. It was simply unrecognized. I leaned forward slightly, not enough to create pressure, just enough to signal engagement, because the balance had shifted again, and now the conversation required precision. Then I want to know which piece I am missing, I replied, and for the first time, there was a pause that did not feel controlled, not entirely, a fraction longer than before, a hesitation not in what to say, but in whether to say it at all. She exhaled slowly, her eyes lowering for just a moment, not in avoidance, but in alignment, as if connecting something internal. Before bringing it into the open, and when her gaze lifted again, it carried something different, not vulnerability, but clarity. You think you started this, she said quietly, and the statement was not confrontational, not accusatory, it was observational, almost detached, but you did not, and the words settled into the room with a weight that could not be ignored. Because they challenged the foundation of everything that had led to this moment, I remained still, absorbing it, because reacting would have been premature, and she continued, not rushing, not filling the silence, but allowing each word to land exactly where it needed to. That restaurant, that moment, the child, she said, her voice even, controlled, none of it was random, and there it was, the line that redefined the entire sequence, not as coincidence, not as discovery, but as design. I felt the shift then, not emotional, not visible, but structural, like a pattern revealing itself after being hidden in plain sight, and I understood what she was implying without needing further explanation, because in my world, nothing that precise happens by accident. I reached for the glass again, not out of habit, but to anchor the moment, to give it a physical point of reference as the implications settled into place, and when I set it down, my voice remained unchanged, steady, controlled, carrying none of the movement beneath it. Then someone wanted me to see you, and I watched her closely as I said it, because confirmation does not always come in words. She did not nod, she did not speak, but the absence of denial was enough. And in that silence, the truth became clear. This was never about finding her, it was about being led to her, and that meant the next question was no longer about her past, but about the intention behind the path that had brought us both into this room at the exact same time. Once a pattern reveals intention, the only thing that matters is who benefits from it, and in that moment, the answer was no longer abstract, it was personal. I did not look away from Naomi, but my focus shifted beyond her, tracing the sequence backward in my mind, the restaurant, the timing, the child, the precision of the situation. Each element placed with just enough unpredictability to appear natural while remaining controlled, and that level of design does not exist without purpose. Then this was never about you, I said quietly, not dismissing her role, but reframing it, and she did not correct me, which meant the statement held weight. She sat still, composed, her hands resting exactly where they had been since she entered, as if even now she was maintaining a structure that extended far beyond this room, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried something new, not tension, not resistance, but a kind of inevitability. I was part of it, she said, and the distinction mattered, because she was not claiming ownership, only participation. I leaned back slightly, allowing the space between us to settle into something more defined, because the conversation had crossed into territory where words were no longer just information, they were confirmation. And now, I continued, my tone unchanged, you are here, with me, and I let that statement stand on its own, because the implication was clear. Whatever had been set in motion had reached its intended point. Naomi's eyes held mine, steady, unwavering, and for a moment the room felt smaller, not confined, but focused, as if everything outside of it had been deliberately removed. You think this is the end of the sequence, she said, and there was no challenge in her voice, only clarity, but this is where it begins, and the words settled with a precision that mirrored everything I had observed since the first moment I saw her. I did not respond immediately, because reacting would have reduced the statement to something ordinary, and there was nothing ordinary about what she was implying. Instead, I reached for the folder once more, closing it this time, not because it was no longer relevant, but because it had served its purpose. The information inside it had already done what it needed to do. Then someone expects something from me, I said, not as a question, but as a conclusion, and I watched her carefully, because this was the point where most people reveal alignment, whether intentional or not. She did not hesitate, did not redirect, and that alone was enough. They expect you to recognize it, she replied, and the phrasing was deliberate, not to act, not to respond, but to recognize, which meant the next step was not being given, it was being left for me to determine. I stood slowly, not breaking eye contact, because leaving too quickly would have suggested urgency, and there was none, not outwardly. The air in the room remained still, unchanged, as if the conversation had not altered anything at all, and yet everything had shifted. Naomi did not move, did not follow, she remained exactly where she was, as if her role in this moment had already been completed. I reached into my pocket, retrieving my phone, the familiar weight grounding the abstract into something tangible once again, and as I turned toward the door, I paused just long enough to let the final piece settle into place. Because understanding is not complete until it is acknowledged, then they chose the wrong moment, I said, my voice calm, controlled, carrying no trace of the movement beneath it, and when I stepped out into the hallway, the world outside continued exactly as it always had, unaware that somewhere within its structure, a sequence had just revealed itself, one that did not end in that room, but extended far beyond it, into a design that had only just begun to show its shape.